AM radio, an op-ed column, and Fox News is not enough. I want a center-right nation to fight for its soul, and its soul is represented in the arts. Its soul is represented in a world in which media is everything. AM radio is the lowest form of communication. It's tinny, it's not robust, it's not Avatar. I want Avatar. I want the right to enter the world of media to the extent and invest in media the way that the left does.
The fake media is trying to silence us, but we will not let them, because the people know the truth. The fake media tried to stop us from going to the White House, but I'm president and they're not.
You're listening to the Curt Schilling Podcast, a Breitbart.com podcast. The podcast starts now. Here's Curt with today's headlines.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to podcast number 11. Got a great day today. It's hot as all hell around the country, and the show's going to be a scorcher as well. Got Clay Travis is going to be my first guest this morning. The range of topics are going to be fun. Everything from the massive amount of news coming out of the NHL, big news with Tavares going to Toronto, Van Riemsdyk to Philly, waiting now for the Carlson shoe to drop. We'll talk sports. Apparently, you can beat the hell out of your Uber driver, but don't you dare inflate a football to a non-legal pressure. You know what? I want to start off with insanity. TDS is clearly something that is every bit as infectious and growing as rampant as STDs. Trump derangement syndrome has hit a new level here, guys. I want you to listen to a couple sound bites this morning. If you guys remember, and I'm sure most of you do, 8 or 9 times President Obama came out during his presidency after an event or an incident, and he was wrong every single time. From calling Boston police officer racist to Trayvon Martin to Michael Brown and the lie of hands up, don't shoot, which spawned Black Lives Matter, all of it. Why is it the Democratic Party dislikes law enforcement, number one? There's another version of it going on now. I want you to listen to Senator Dick Durbin, whose parents were very prophetic in naming their son. Now remember, ICE is the group of law enforcement agents tasked with protecting our borders, keeping illegals from the country, illegals being child traffickers, smugglers, human traffickers, terrorists, all the cartel people. ICE, they're pretty much in one of the most dangerous places in the country. Listen to Dick Durbin talk about ICE.
Look at these families on the hottest day of the year in Chicago, bringing their kids out here and marching for other families. 2/3 of the American people have said the zero-tolerance policy of Donald Trump, separating children from their families, is just plain wrong. These folks are going to walk in the streets today to make that point, which is what you do in a democracy.
Look, you're a senator. You obviously can have your voice heard, but there are some people who feel very frustrated right now with not being able to make change. We've been talking immigration for quite some time. What can happen? What can be changed now so people can have some sort of relief?
Let me tell you, I believe in 2 things. I believe in the goodness and values of the American people, and I believe in the Constitution. And the Constitution tells us in November, we get a chance to speak. And I'm asking people across the United States, voters, participate, be part of this election. Don't stay home and curse the television, sorry, but come on out, use your citizens' right to vote. That's the most important thing.
When I walk around here, there's a lot of people with passions, and people brought their children here. They're walking around with signs. They obviously want people like yourself to do something. What should you tell the other members of Congress at this point? What should they do to make some change happen?
They can either listen today or they're going to hear the message in November. I think the American people are going to speak loudly that they're sick and tired of what's happening in terms of this immigration policy. Look at ICE. What a group of incompetents. At this point, they're focused more on toddlers than terrorists. They wanted, instead of deporting felons, they want to deport families that are being persecuted by criminal gangs. We're in the middle of the worst drug epidemic in our history, and instead of focusing on stopping bad drugs from coming in and stopping dirty drug money from going out, they're focusing on separating kids from their families.
Senator, I hear the passion in your voice. What are you going to tell these people today, and how has this affected you personally?
Here's the good news for this crowd. No politicians will be speaking. There are going to be members of the clergy and those representing the families. We'll be in the crowd, as we should be. I hope taking back the message to Washington that it's time to put an end to this cruel and incompetent policy.
That was from CNN, by the way. Okay, pardon my French, but what the He truly is such a dick. The hottest day of the year, talking about families in Chicago. What about those ICE agents on the border where it's 50 degrees hotter? What about them? Incompetent? He talks about the worst drug epidemic in our history. That's what they do. And he's making up, number one, because ICE is not running around handcuffing kids. I mean, it's just stupid. We know that because we've seen the pictures. And by the way, this isn't Trump's policy. This is an Obama-era policy. And 9 times out of 10, you're separating these kids from people that aren't their parents. They're their traffickers. They're peddling in child trafficking. But what an asshole. Yes, you know what? Our voices are going to be heard in November. I'm going to say it a couple times today. The walk away. Hashtag walk away. It is a movement. It is happening. And I want you guys to check out a YouTube video titled Why I Left Liberalism and the Democratic Party. Hashtag walk away. Go to YouTube. Listen to that right now. There's tweets by a young man who was a liberal, and he's walking away. And I compiled his tweets and put them into one post on my Facebook page, on my blog at WordPress.38pitches.com as well. And there's also a young man named CJ Pearson. He is at the CJ Pearson, Pearson. Follow him on Twitter. He's a young black man who, God bless him, is speaking up. We have our law enforcement having their backs turned on once again. I've said it before. There is a person in our government who epitomizes everything we despise about politics. There's actually now a couple of them, but she was at the lead for me. I want you to listen to what Elizabeth Warren thinks needs to happen with our immigration system.
This is about children held in cages. This is about babies scattered all across this country. This is about mamas who want their children back. President Trump seems to think that the only way to have immigration rules is to rip parents from their families, is to treat rape victims and refugees like terrorists, and to put children in cages. This is ugly, this is wrong, and this is not the way to run our country. The president's deeply immoral actions have made it obvious we need to rebuild our immigration system from top to bottom, starting by replacing ICE with something that reflects our morality and that works. This moment is a moral crisis for our country. Dr. Martin Luther King said, "There comes a time when silence is betrayal." We will not be silent. We cannot be silent. We will build a country that reflects our values. That is why we are here.
I would tell her to shut up, but I do want her to keep talking just to expose the ignorance. We have the country we wanted to build with our values. We're not talking about immigrants. We're talking about illegal immigrants. There's such a dramatic difference and the left continues to try and make sure you're confused by that. We're not talking about people seeking asylum. We're talking about the thousands and thousands of people taking advantage of the Obama era another screw up from the Obama era that allowed you to be released if you showed up at the border with a child. Doesn't have to be your child. You can just lie and say it is. I mean, my God. She wants to replace ICE with something that reflects our values, and by our values, she meant borderless. She wants to replace ICE with nothing because they want a borderless country. You can't be a sovereign nation without borders. The idiocy from Dick Durbin and Elizabeth Warren was actually summed up kind of nicely on Fox and Friends. And by the way, that was from CNN, I believe. when I think about confrontation of the left and the right, and I think about my team, I think about strong women. The left is supposedly for women, which it's not actually. But I think about Sarah Huckabee Sanders, and I think about Sarah Palin, and I think about Nikki Haley, all these strong women. Now, I think about this one, too. Kellyanne Conway was on Fox and Friends, and I want you to listen to her kind of summarize her thoughts on the Democrats wanting to abolish ICE. Listen up.
This is a very simple binary choice. You're either for a sovereign nation that has a border, or you're for open borders and a lot of the crime that comes with that. And the call for the abolition of ICE, in my view, is the intersection of arrogance and ignorance. And it's also all of these people preening for leverage in 2020. Really, folks, because what exactly have you done in 2018 that you're worried, or 2017 for that matter, that you're worried about 2020? You've got smarter, I think, more senior Democrats like Senator Blumenthal of Connecticut this week saying he doesn't think that calling for the abolishing of ICE is a fruitful exercise, pushing back against folks like Kirsten Gillibrand, the senator from New York who not so long ago was a center-right member of Congress. For her to call for Cynthia Nixon to refer to ICE as a terrorist organization, those brave men and women in Immigrations and Custom Enforcement are doing their job. ICE was created in 2003 in response to 9/11, to the non-criminal aliens that executed the awful terror attack on America. And these folks are trying to execute on Immigration and Customs Enforcement in many ways. Last year, for example, they confiscated about 2,500 pounds of fentanyl. That is a synthetic opioid, 50 times the potency of heroin, 100 times the potency of morphine. That was enough fentanyl, ladies and gentlemen, to have killed every American.
Oh, my goodness.
They just in Kirsten Gillibrand's New York recently, ICE apprehended 40 criminals. So the idea that you would abolish ICE seems to me to be a very unfortunate talking point. But look, if the Democrats are running on that, I think you've got Maxine Waters attacking Chuck Schumer. You have Dick Blumenthal attacking Kirsten Gillibrand, and the woman who just won in the Bronx view on ICE.
Civil war inside the Democratic
And by the way,
Party.
Bill de Blasio is running to the border. Your mayor in New York running to the border. Abolish ICE, abolish ICE. Have you looked around lately? He's got a lot of problems in his own city.
Yeah.
He can stay there and correct them and help the people in need there.
Oh, voice of reason. And again, I'm starting to see something that is giving me hope. Hashtag walk away is I want to point you guys again to Why I Left Liberalism and the Democratic Party. It's a YouTube video. You absolutely have to watch it and listen to it. And also check out a young man named C.J. Pearson, the C.J. Pearson, Pearson. Check him out on Twitter. I'm hoping that there is this great awakening happening, true awakening, because the left is doubling down and tripling down. Look no further for the standard bearer of the left than MSNBC's Joy Reid, herself a admitted homophobic bigot who somehow still has a job, even though she lied her ass off about her Twitter account. She was talking to Maxine Waters on MSNBC the other day, and Maxine called for public confrontation of conservatives and Trump party members. And I've said before, I believe she's going to end up getting somebody killed, and it's going to be on her. But I want you to listen to her, not take it back and say, you know what, I probably went a little bit too far. We want to talk about this and yada yada. We want to peacefully protest. But listen to what she said to Joy Reid the other day.
If Democrats were in the leadership, we would not allow this kind of thing to take place without having hearings, without doing more. Democrats have been going to the borders. Democrats have been trying to find out how this administration has operated, in this immigration policy. And so, no, the Republicans are not doing it. They're not doing the hearings. They're not visiting the borders. They're not doing anything but lying to us about where these children are, because I don't think they even know.
And, a lot of what, folks are hearing when you hear from Democratic voters, Congresswoman, is that there's not a lot of confidence, particularly among young Democrats, that if the Democratic leadership won't stand up to the Trump administration and won't stand up for someone like you who's calling for peaceful civil disobedience, it gives people a lot of doubt that if the House and the Senate were to change hands, that Democrats would actually be much stronger than what they've seen to date. Should people feel confident that the Democratic Party would strongly oppose this president if they were to regain leadership in the House?
Well, let me just tell you this. First of all, The people of this country, no matter Republican or Democrat, do not like the idea that children have been separated. And so Republicans are making a mistake thinking they can hold on to that constituency that so-called belongs to Donald Trump. On this issue, Republicans and Democrats, independents alike, are opposed to what is going on. And yes, people do want to see us be stronger and more forceful and to confront them on these policies. And I'm hopeful that even Democrats haven't seen the kind of outpouring of protests, over 700 incidences of protests this weekend. Seeing that, they will be more forceful, more confrontational, and more prepared to push back on this administration. I think that the people are showing them this is what they would have us do.
There's your strong liberal women right there, Joy Reid and Maxine Waters. She's so full of crap. Everybody's against something that's not actually happening because she's lying and they're lying about everything that's going on at the border. We've seen the pictures of Trump-era stuff. We initially were exposed to the quote-unquote horror of those photos of the separations and the cages. Turns out that was during the Obama reign, and Obama deported more people than any administration before him. If you have laws and you don't uphold them, you don't have laws. And the fact of the matter is there are 2.7 million legal American children separated from their parents in prison today. That's what happens when you break the law. You don't get to take your kids to jail. Now, the fact of the matter is, if there's a situation where a woman fleeing Venezuela with her two, preteen kids and walking across Mexico 1,000 miles or whatever it is, she's not being separated and cuffed like people are being led to believe. There's a right way and a wrong way to do this. The right way is to seek asylum. And that woman is seeking asylum from an abusive husband or whatever. But many, 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 many of them are not. Many of them are just trying to get over here and get on, because over here, our government will take care of you. Their government won't take care of them back home. They make them work. They make them do things that earn their place. They make them have a government ID to vote in their election. But apparently that is now seen as something racist. Anyway, Mexico went over the cliff this past week. They elected just a full-blown communist. Part of the reason you're hearing the word socialism as a positive thing from a generation of young people is they have no idea what socialism actually is. They think it's a happy world where everybody gets along and nobody's better than anybody else. That's not how it works. I want you to listen to former Secret Service agent Dan Bongino talking on Fox and Friends, and basically saying what I just said, but very much clearer, and it's all true. Listen to him.
Socialism is a disaster. The only people who support socialism are people who don't know what it is or people who want to win elections. And nobody else actually is. I mean, do we understand what socialism is? I tweeted that out this week and I saw a survey. Millennials overwhelmingly prefer socialism. I said, that's because they don't know what it is. Socialism is the government control of the means of production, right? Meaning your farms, your factories, your service industries, your industries, your jobs, your income. That's all controlled by the government. It's interesting that people tweet that stuff. Like, I support socialism, not even realizing you wouldn't even own that iPhone if you were living in a socialist government.
Everybody wants socialism for everybody else. The people that love socialism, the Hollywood people that talk about it, they love socialism as long as they're not under the thumb of it. Basically, socialism is the government overseeing and handling 100% of a country's productivity and having their grips and hands on all of it. And it has never, in the history of the world, worked. You heard Bernie Sanders talk about it over in Norway and the Netherlands, and it doesn't work, people. It's never worked. The examples you're being told of are not working. They're lying to you about the success. Talk to people in Norway. Talk to people in Sweden. From the cradle to the grave, they are run by their government. Their lives are run by their government. Anyway, Clay Travis is going to join me after the break, and we're going to talk about anything and everything under the sun and see how many liberals we can trigger.
Breitbart News Daily with Alex Marlow.
Why did we see some of the Republican kissing of Mark Zuckerberg that was taking place?
I called it kissing the ring because I felt like every single person practically had to kiss the ring of this guy, who wants to do nothing except get all those people out of office. So, bizarre behavior from the Republicans.
Breitbart News Daily, weekdays at 6 a.m. Eastern on SiriusXM Patriot 125.
You're listening to the Curt Schilling Podcast. Once again, here's Curt Schilling.
Welcome back, guys. Joining me now is, for the first time on the podcast, is Clay Travis of Outkick the Coverage. How you doing, Clay?
I'm doing well. Getting ready for the 4th down on the beach with the family, living the dream, my man.
Make sure you take a jacket. It's getting chilly out here. Hey, listen, apparently it's okay to beat the hell out of your Uber driver or a woman in the NFL, but if you inflate footballs or are caught lying about inflating footballs, you're in much bigger trouble. What the hell are they doing with this Jameis Winston stuff? And what kind of message? Well, actually, I shouldn't ask you what kind of message. I don't think they ever try to send a message. But they don't realize how stupid they look doing stuff like this?
Yeah, I think the problem in general with precedents is, and this is why I was against the idea of the NFL starting their own investigations into whether or not players had misbehaved off the field. We got the criminal justice system for that. And if you want to suspend somebody based on what the criminal justice system uncovers, I think that's fine. But they've now set the precedent somehow. It's incredibly broken to me that Jameis Winston can grope his Uber driver. And obviously Jameis Winston had a lot of issues before this as well from college. And then he can only miss 3 games. But like you said, if Tom Brady they still can't prove that he deflated footballs, but they suspended him 4 games for that. Yeah.
Right. I'm mocking it. I'm just trying to make fun. Sexual assault's not funny, but the fact of the matter is the NFL doesn't know their ass from a hole in the ground, and their enforcement of their quote-unquote rules is an example of that. There's no doubt in my mind this national anthem thing is going to blow up in their faces somehow. But I don't watch football anymore, so I'm okay with that. I am a devout, loyal, religious hockey fan. I don't know how much hockey you like or love or don't like. What a weekend. Holy crap. Tavares going to Toronto, which totally I was the opposite of right on that one. Wrong in every way. But I know as an athlete the allure of working and going home to play is a big one, and apparently it won out. I think Toronto looks to be a problem for the East next year after that one.
Yeah, well, and also, I mean, Canada hasn't won the Stanley Cup since 1993, so I immediately looked at the odds, not to rub it in on Canadians there, but I looked at the odds, and Toronto is now the favorite to win the Stanley Cup, which, let's be honest, even in the playoffs, that doesn't necessarily mean anything given how wild hockey can be. But they're the favorites. I think the Nashville Predators are number 2 in the most recent list that I saw. So I've become a Nashville Predator fan. My kids have gotten into hockey. We like to go to games. So yeah, we have a good time with those. It's an awesome environment, atmosphere in Nashville for those games.
I've got a 16-year-old who's actually going to Prague in a couple weeks as a goalie for a U.S. team. I'm a hockey dad, and I'm in love with it. Speaking of skipping all over the map, one of my listeners, one of my loyal fans, wanted me to ask you if you were thinking about or going to run for Senate in Tennessee.
Yeah, I seriously looked into it, and that's because I just think people have gone insane in this country in general.
Agreed.
And so I seriously looked into it. And what would have been required is I would have had to give up my radio show in order to be able to run. And so ultimately I decided that I think I have kind of the best gig out there right now with the radio show and being able to say exactly what I think. So I'm not going to run this go around. Plus my wife, I've got a 10, a 7, and a 3-year-old, 3 little boys. And my wife is not that excited about me upsetting the apple cart of our life right now and doing something like that. But I appreciate the question. I legitimately looked into it and decided not to do it. I'm going to be continuing to do what I do right now, and maybe in 5 or 6 years I'll look at it again.
I did the very same thing. I contemplated a run against Warren here in Mass. I would give anything to get on stage with that woman and debate any topics you wanted to. But now, after seeing what the rules are for politicians as it relates to the media, that the families are now open game and fair game, I didn't think it was fair to put my family in front of that crosshair. After 20-some years in baseball and had my family kind of giving away a lot of their time, I didn't think it was worth it. I mean, what people are doing, what they're doing to families now. I mean, watching Sarah Huckabee Sanders last week and all the things that have come out of that. Let me ask you something. I mean, you're somebody people know. Have you had any public incidents that have gotten uncomfortable in the recent past?
I have not. I had that. I've got the book coming out this fall, and I feel like, I came into doing what I do now by talking about SEC football, which is maybe the craziest fan bases that exist anywhere in the country. And so, and I'll say good and bad things about different teams. And I kind of have anticipated that at some point in time I would have an issue. And in, 14 years of talking SEC football and being all over the place, bars, restaurants, stadiums, I've never had an uncomfortable encounter. And so I saw what happened to her, to Sarah Huckabee Sanders, and I just thought it was ridiculous. I am a capitalist, and as a capitalist, I believe that if you have an open establishment like that, you should serve everybody dinner. I think it's a strange precedent that we're setting, but I kind of am open to the idea that it might happen because it seems like certain societal norms are being broken on a regular basis. But so far, I haven't had anything like that happen to me.
I haven't either. Most of the reason is because they're awesome behind the keyboard, but face to face, they aren't the tough people they proclaim to be. Hey, listen, let's talk ESPN for a minute. Very few people can understand the environment. Well, almost no one can if you didn't actually work there. I remember, and I got fired for being a conservative and for saying conservative things, and that's all out there, and that's public, and that's all fine and well. But people don't understand what an incredibly oppressive environment that was for discussion about anything other than liberal politics. I had people come up to me and whisper like we were in some secret club, hey, listen, I agree with you politically, but, just keep doing what you're doing. Like, they were terrified to be overheard. And when you look around inside that building and listen to those people, it is the most liberal, left-leaning, hardcore group of people in media, short of CNN and MSNBC. They're out in the open now. I mean, it's all out in the open, and they continue to deny what they are.
Yeah, and I think, again, to me, the storyline that needs to be getting more attention is like you said, what happened to you. And in particular, what I would say is I'm troubled in general by this precedent that we seem to have set. I started off talking precedents with you. But, if you can't go on your own Facebook account or your own Twitter account and share your personal political opinions off the air, I think it's a bad precedent to set, and it's certainly an awful precedent to set of we're only going to maintain that standard when it comes to conservative political beliefs because, I think most people out there, regardless of whether you're a liberal, Democrat, or a conservative Republican or whatever you are, don't think that your political opinion should have to mirror the company that employs you. Right. And I think it would be different, like you said, like I've said before, and this is in my book. I mean, I say, look, if Curt Schilling had come back and he had said, hey, I can't believe the Yankees didn't pull this closer. And by the way, we need to build a wall to make, if you're on air with ESPN and you advocate your political beliefs and they have absolutely no connection to your job, then I can understand them being like, hey, we're not going to allow this to happen. But the idea that you don't have the ability to share your political views in your private life, and that they're going to allow Jemele Hill to say all of the things that she has said and a lot of other left-leaning or far-left people at ESPN, it's just like you got to have the precedent and apply it the same way regardless of the political speech, and that's what kind of drives me insane.
Well, I tried to tell people, my First Amendment rights weren't abridged. I was free to speak as I please. The fact of the matter is in the private sector, when you work for somebody else, they get to make the rules. The rules of the ESPN were, if you say something conservative, we're going to slap your hand. And, because I'm sure you saw the memos. I got memos, hey, we're not a political company saying political things. The frustrating thing for me was I was the only one being held to that standard. Because, Stephen A. Smith was on a daily basis blaming white people. I remember him blaming Gruden's brother for Robert Griffin not starting when, in fact, he wasn't starting because he sucked. And it was about him being black, and everything was about being black. And Monty Jones wears a Caucasian T-shirt, and it's celebrated funny ha-ha. People just don't understand. And the fact that they continue to try and deny who and what they are is comical as they bleed 1 million viewers a month. But it couldn't happen to a bunch of better people, and especially the karma that got John Skipper, because that whole alcohol story is about as real as me running a 4-minute mile. So anyway, hey, listen, talk to me about the baseball season. What's your thoughts up to date, up to now, about what's going on, and who are your odds-on favorites right now to end up in October?
So, I mean, obviously the way we finished the season was with an epic World Series 7-gamer, and the Dodgers trying to get back and win for the first time since '88. I was kind of rooting for that story, but I also loved the Astros story. So obviously the Astros have picked up where they left off, continuing to roll pretty much. I think the return of the Yankee-Red Sox rivalry is probably the number one story on kind of a national scale so far this year. I think the Dodgers have started to pick things up, and that everything that's going on in the NL West, it certainly makes you believe that they can make a run in there. The Giants have picked things up a little bit too. But I think the number one story so far of the baseball season has been the Yankees are back, to the extent that they were ever completely gone. And that Yankee-Red Sox rivalry looks like, they legitimately could be the two best teams in baseball right now.
They beat the dog snot out of David Price last night. I loved a couple years back when they made the Andrew Miller deal. I thought they won that trading deadline. I thought Brian Cashman began to put together a really good young group. They're coming. I think they jumped the shark a little bit. They got out a little early ahead of themselves getting to the postseason. But I love what they're doing. People always talk about Red Sox-Yankees, and the only other thing I tell people is, short of Auburn, Alabama, I think it's the best rivalry, the biggest rivalry in sports. I mean, I've never been a big college. I didn't go to college. I was a Sun Devil fan growing up, but I never had any concept of the scope of those rivalries in the SEC. Their stadium's holding 100-some thousand people, and literally it seems like there's 100,000 more in the parking lot, and the entire student body is somewhere near, and it's a Who concert times 10 from a decibel level.
Yeah, I always say if you want to, it should be on everybody's bucket list, even if you live in the Northeast, if you're out in California, if you're far geographically from the location, make it down for a couple of the big, kind of southern rivalry games. One advantage that we have is from a tailgate perspective, September, October, November is still good weather down here. So unlike, for instance, my wife is from Big Ten country and went to Michigan undergrad, but she's like, man, we got to, wear the heavy coats by the time it gets into November and even sometimes in late October. And I'm like, yeah, we don't have to worry about that. We got gorgeous girls walking around in sundresses, alcohol plenty, and the weather is usually perfect. So it's a pretty heavenly experience. It's definitely something everybody should put on their sports bucket list.
I got to ask you, as someone knee deep in college football, where do you stand on paying college athletes? I have a very different perspective or view about that, but I'm wondering where somebody that is an ardent college football fan feels or stands on that subject. You're talking about athletes who bring hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue to these colleges, most of them in college to get to the NFL. Where do you stand on that one?
I'm a capitalist, so I think in general that what you should be able to do is go pro when you are able to go pro. And so I think if every sport could do what baseball did, it would probably be ideal. I know for football it's a little bit tougher, but if you at 18 years old, certainly in the NBA, and I think in football you should be able to leave whenever you want, whenever people are interested in drafting you because of the physical toll. But I think that would solve a lot of the should players be paid angle. Then you have an option. Okay, hey, if I want to go get an education and I want to go get a degree and I want to play football, like that's an ideal kind of situation, and you're being compensated with that. And then maybe you have the opportunity to go pro after you've been there for a few years. But that to me is like I always say, we don't require Taylor Swift to go sing in the Vanderbilt chorus for a year before she's allowed to release an album. And certainly with what you did in baseball, right, at 18 years old, if you want to go play in the minor leagues, you're able to do that if you so desire. And I think you should just have options. I'm a believer in options, and I'm a believer in being able to balance out your money and figure out what makes sense for you and your family. So I like more options as opposed to less.
I'm with you right there. Lastly, let's go back to politics. The left is unhinged over the Kennedy retirement announcement. next week, the 9th, we're going to hear Trump's replacement. There's nothing Democrats can do about it. I mean, he's going to appoint another Supreme Court justice, and it's going to be someone who's a Constitution-adhering judge. There's no doubt in my mind. Apparently, that means to the left, get your abortions yesterday, because for some reason they believe abortion is immediately going to be banned or whatever it is. I feel like we're heading towards a confrontation, a physically dangerous public confrontation of significance. And I can't see anything that puts the brakes on this runaway train heading in both directions. And I'm wondering, as someone who sports tends to mirror life in many ways, but right now I feel like this country is derailing in a horrible way, and I can't see anything that can stop it. And I'm worried that we're going to get to a place where the confrontation is going to become physical, violent, and big.
I worry about that too, and I think a big part of that is social media. I'm trying to think, because in the grand scheme of things, I'm a history guy, right? Like I was a history major in undergrad. I love reading and studying everything about our country's past. The things that we are fighting over today are, relatively speaking, not that grand in the larger universe of things that we have battled over throughout this country's history. And so, people want to compare us to, say, 1968 right now. And I go back and I say, well, wait a minute. In 1968, MLK and RFK both got assassinated. We were at war in Vietnam. We had the draft going on. There are major the sort of geopolitical tensions and internal conflict that was coming to a head. Right now, we got the lowest unemployment rate basically in recorded history for all races and all ethnic groups, right? We've got a stock market that is near, relatively speaking, all-time highs. We have got a peaceful country in terms of the danger that day-to-day you or I or anybody in our families face. And so I feel like people just want to be angry, and I'm with you that I feel like we are trending towards a physically violent confrontation that is going to I don't worry so much about people from external parts of the world trying to impact us right now. I feel like many parts of our country are falling apart in terms of the way that we're going at it. And I think it's based on social media. So, look, I'm with you. I mean, look, elections have consequences, and Donald Trump has the right under the Constitution to appoint a justice to replace Anthony Kennedy. And if Democrats don't have the majority in the Senate, and if they took away the right to filibuster, then to me, like, Trump gets the right opportunity to put forward his guy or girl, and the Republicans get to see whether or not they can get 51 votes.
It's karma, baby. It is karma in a beautiful, beautiful way. Clay, listen, man, I really appreciate you joining me, and I would love to have you back. Always here if you need me, but keep doing what you're doing, bub.
No, for sure. I need to get you on my show again, too, and I appreciate you taking the time, and keep up the good work.
Breitbart News Tonight with Joel Pollack and Rebecca Mansour.
The real thing that the left is angry about is they're like, how could you allow these Russian memes? Somebody saw a meme, and then they decided they had to vote for Trump. Or it must have been fake news. And by fake news, they mean conservative websites. Come on. But this is what the left thinks. Fake news. And by fake news, what they mean is shut down Breitbart.
Breitbart News Tonight. Weeknights, starting at 9 p.m. East on Sirius XM Patriot 125. We want to hear from you. Tweet the show at Garrick38. Once again, here's Curt Schilling.
Welcome back. I haven't talked to her in a couple of weeks. She is the national security editor at Breitbart.com. She is the one and only Frances Martel. Hey, Frances.
Good morning. Thanks so much for having me.
Always good to have you. I'm going to get right to it. Apparently, I believe it to be true, but when two heads of state sit down to a table and talk, that's a good thing. The left had us believing that sitting down with Kim Jong-un was the worst possible thing. We was going to start a nuclear war. Nothing of the sort happened. It turns out that we may actually have an end to the Korean War finally, and we've gotten remains of our soldiers back, yada, 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 doing good things. Now we find out Mr. Bolton has made a trip over and talked to people in the Kremlin, and President Trump and President Putin are going to sit down at the table together. First off, that's a good thing. Am I right? That's a good thing.
Well, it's better than nothing. And at this point, I mean, when the Kremlin announced this, they described the quote-unquote sad state of our bilateral relations. So it's not going too great. And we'll see what they talk about. I have low expectations that it will be productive, but I also have no expectations that it will be counterproductive. I think at the worst, it will be a neutral exchange.
Well, you've got two of the kind of the epitome of Type A people. I don't doubt for a second that Trump doesn't do anything for posterity's sake or for appearances. He tries to get stuff done. I don't know what the end goal is other than peace in our time, but the fact of the matter is I don't see a downside to this other than them breaking out into a fist fight. I don't see that happening. But what's the topic? I'm not going to hold you to this, but if you're talking to the president and you're advising him on a potential meeting with Vladimir Putin, what are you advising him? Where are you steering him to the conversation? What topics do you think are going to be vital for him to bring up and put on the table?
Well, I think the most productive realm of discussion is Syria by far. And I think President Trump's major challenge in this conversation is to convince Russia that allying with Iran is not profitable, that Iran's regime is waning, that the protests are hurting the Ayatollah, and that regime is going to be gone soon, and that it's much more profitable to Russia and much more in Russia's interests to work with Israel and to work with the United States in Syria and give up Assad. And I think to a certain extent that seems to be working. Russia obviously is still a major backer of the Assad regime, but we've seen some silent cooperation with Israel. We've seen a little bit of distance between Russia and Iran, and we've seen some closeness between Russia and Turkey, which Turkey is one of Assad's biggest rivals in the area. So I think there's a wedge there that can be reasonably split. I think there's much more productive conversation to be had there than, for example, on the Crimean Peninsula, which the Russian regime has committed international crimes by invading and colonizing this territory. But are you really going to convince Putin of that by challenging him head first? I think you have a much better chance talking about Syria and convincing him that Iran is not a reliable ally than you do of convincing him that his entire life's dream of reconstructing the Soviet Union is an evil ideology and an evil move.
Let me ask you to put, I think many times one of the best ways to go through something like this is to kind of role play it out. If you're Putin, get into his head as best you can and tell me what you think he may be coming to the table for. What do you think he has or could potentially have as goals to a face-to-face with Trump?
Russia has a lamentable economy, to put it mildly. Yes, they have natural gas. Yes, they have some oil. But given the size of the Russian state and given the size of Putin's ambitions, that economy is not doing too great. So I'm coming to the table looking for a way to deal with Trump that will allow me to become more profitable, especially when you see Trump challenging China so aggressively and challenging much of the world with these tariff policies. If I'm Putin, I come in and say, you're upset at Canada, you're upset at China. Well, Russia, you can't trade with us because of sanctions. Maybe if you lift these sanctions and do business with Russia, you can afford to have a heavier hand on other countries that are taking advantage of you. I think that would be a very manipulative way to try to find an end to these sanctions and strengthen the economy, because at the end of the day, without a strong economy, Putin is simply not a threat to us.
And let me ask you, which is a great segue, let me ask you your thoughts on the tariffs. I mean, if you're, and here's the way I look at this, if you're one of the leading, if not the leading in the world production center, shipping, export, import, whatever, and the people you're trading with are putting tariffs on your products and you're not reciprocating, you're being taken advantage of. The only way to fix that, in my opinion, is to say, listen, either you stop or we put them on yours. No one, the consumer wins in none of those instances. But what do you feel like the reaction has been from Canada, from China, all the countries we put tariffs on, number one? And number two, how do you fix it, or is it fixable?
Well, I think it is fixable. I don't think it's fixable with China. I certainly think it's fixable with Canada. I think it's a brilliant move on the Canadian part because it makes Trudeau out to be an enemy. And Trudeau is already not as well liked in Canada as he was when he was first elected. I think if the Canadian economy takes a downturn, the Liberals, the left up there, are not going to do very well in the next election. And of course, a more conservative government in Canada is beneficial to the United States. So that's a smart move on that part. On the Chinese angle, anything that gets us doing business with China less, to me, is of utmost importance. The hypocrisy that we have, where we have this embargo on Cuba for human rights abuses, but we don't have the same thing on China, I think is abhorrent, especially when China is using our economics to steal our intellectual property. They're profiting off of theft and breaking international law, and then using that profit to subjugate their own people. So if you ask me, I think there's a moral obligation to not trade with China. I think we should embargo China. But if we're not going to do that, at least the tariffs are going to bring us one step closer. It's going to teach China that we're taking very seriously all of their illegal activity around the world, from the South China Sea colonization to the theft of intellectual property to currency manipulation. We're taking it all seriously. And the interesting thing is Trump's not really phrasing it that way, right? He's phrasing it as China's taking advantage of our economy. I'm only making things fair. I think that's going to be much more amenable to the average American ear than straight up saying, we don't trust China and we're going to flat out call them, criminals, international criminals, and not trade with them. That, I think, I can hear the cable news pundits going on about how potential war with China is going to happen and how the language isn't diplomatic. So instead, he's simply saying, I'm trying to make things fair. Which I think is a smart move. But at the end of the day, it benefits America to cut that economic line that we have to China, because all it does is poison our economy with either Chinese attempts at Chinese control of our corporations, Chinese theft of our intellectual property, and in general benefiting this regime that is hurting its own people with our money.
All right, I'm going to switch gears. Mexico. The dude they just elected doesn't get much more left than that, other than the young lady elected in New York the other day, or that won the primary. I don't like a country that I always have felt is unstable to begin with, a country that I don't think anybody would question is run by the cartels. I don't like them doing something even farther left, and this guy is a full-blown communist. Their presidential election, they put a person in power who is pretty much the antithesis of the things our country was founded on, and they're now, that's our southern neighbor. What are your thoughts on that whole thing and how that played out? What does it mean for Mexico?
Well, it's such a tragedy on so many levels, and I'll tell you why it's a tragedy, because I firmly believe the Mexican people don't want a communist to be their president. They just felt that they had no choice. And the way I know this is this guy, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, has run for president 3 other times, and he's been widely rejected in the other elections. Right. And I think the day that he won the election was the day that Peña Nieto refused to properly address the missing people in Guerrero province about a year and a half ago. Right. Students that were simply protesting violence disappeared. The frequency with which there are mass graves of disappeared people that are carved out by cartels, the violence is out of control, and the ruling parties have done nothing. The ruling parties are hopelessly corrupt. So it's kind of like Brazil in the sense of the political parties don't really have an ideology. They exist to profit personally off of politics. And so the people are hopeless. The difference between Brazil and Mexico is that in Brazil, you have a conservative who's running for president in October, and he's winning. And he's saying the same thing that AMLO was saying in Mexico. I'm not part of the system. I'm not corrupt. The ideology doesn't even matter. The problem in Mexico is that you've got a guy who won by basically saying, I'm not part of the system, I'm not corrupt. But for the past 10 years, he's been saying that he loves Fidel Castro, that he loves Hugo Chavez, that he hates America. And I don't think the Mexican people like that, but I think they're so fed up with the status quo that they just voted for whoever was left. And AMLO was the only person standing because he had the campaign infrastructure from his past elections to properly challenge the other parties.
I know you're aware of what's going on at the border and all the stuff with ICE and all that stuff going on. But if you could, can you give my listeners and our fans a quick 2-minute summary on why the border is an incredibly dangerous place for the national security? Why keeping the border closed and processing every person that crosses the border is vital to national security because of the terrorists that are infiltrating, the cartels, the human trafficking. Why is it necessary for us to have ICE on the borders and to have our borders legally enforced?
It is necessary because human trafficking is linked to the cartels, and the cartels are inevitably linked to terrorism. So the way it works is if an individual gets to the border by paying a coyote, who is the human trafficker that leads them through the border, that individual whose job it is to traffic the people is linked to a cartel. And then that person profits from the trafficking, and that money goes into the cartel, which is trafficking in drugs. And those cartels, time and time again, have been proven to play ball with anyone who is doing anything illegal on the planet. So, for example, you have the FARC in Colombia, who are tied to Hezbollah and are tied to Shiite extremist groups because they're willing to work with anybody. There's evidence that Mexican cartels have worked with Al-Qaeda in Africa to smuggle drugs through Africa into Europe. So it's not just about the drug cartels trafficking in Mexico and profiting in Mexico, although that is really important because they use their profits to kill people and they use their profits to silence politicians. That's why there's no real government in Mexico, because the cartels have enough money to silence any politician. But the bigger problem, I think, for national security is that any organized terrorist group around the world, be it Hezbollah, Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, etc., if they organize well enough, they can negotiate with these cartels and have access to that border.
Yeah, I think there was something like 350 assassinations in the last couple months of political figures and legal figure, judges and police officers. Let me go around the world real quick before we close up. Should I be reading anything into the Harry S. Truman battle group, the carrier and the battle group that transports Air Wing 1, leaving the Mediterranean and going into the Atlantic? I'm assuming it's because of increased Russian submarine activity, but is that something to be concerned about?
Well, I think I would be a lot more, to go back to the beginning of our conversation, I'd be a lot more concerned if Trump and Putin weren't about to talk face-to-face in a couple of weeks. But sure, I mean, I think it's a recalibration of the threats in the region. I don't know where it's going to go now that it left the area it was in. I wouldn't be surprised if it ends up somewhere still in that side of the world, closer to Yemen, for example, or if it, if it finds itself somewhere near the violence in Nigeria or Niger, where we've had a bit of a secret military presence for a while. But I mean, I think the Russian threat is always there. But again, as I always say, if Russia doesn't have an economy, it is not a threat. And China is Russia with an economy and with a far more sophisticated Communist Party structure. So it's very hard to get me worried about Russia right now.
Right. No, I just want to mention it because it went through the Strait of Gibraltar. It was in port in Marseille, France, and it hopped through the Strait of Gibraltar into the Atlantic. And I was curious to know if there was anything that should put up a red flag. Frances, it's always a pleasure, darling. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me.
Easy winner and loser today. My loser is a woman who works at the Washington Post, columnist Jennifer Rubin, who was on MSNBC's AM Joy. This is her quote. She says that Sarah Huckabee Sanders, quote unquote, deserves a life sentence for being in President Donald Trump's administration and inciting against the press, should be being made uncomfortable. Noah's telling them to be violent protesters, but we're not going to let these people go through life unscathed, Rubin told host Joy Reid, homophobe and bigot Joy Reid. Sarah Huckabee has no right to live a life of no fuss, no muss, after lying to the press, after inciting against the press. These people should be made uncomfortable, and I think that's a life sentence, frankly. I would be very happy to see multiple people outside of this repulsive human being's home. My winner today, a shout-out to the men and women of ICE. I don't know what else to do other than to apologize for many people in my government, for fellow, and I'm using air quotes, citizens of this country. The job you're doing is thankless. It is beyond dangerous, and you are separated from your families, separated from your children, in hopes of trying to defend a country, defend a border, and do the right thing. God bless you guys. God bless you girls. And just know that the vocal minority is not who we are. We're here. We support you. We think about you. We pray for you guys and your and gals and your families and safety. Today's winner, the agents of ICE and ICE itself. Thanks again, guys. I'm out. You guys have a great day. Craig Shirley joins me tomorrow. This is a big week. We're going to have 2 4th of Julys this year. We're going to have one on the 4th of July, and we're going to have one on the 9th of July, because the 9th of July could be bigger fireworks than the 4th.
Everything in hip-hop is not bad. Kanye agreed with us, so let's love him today until he raps tomorrow and you turn your back. Because if you jump off when the fun of the moment is over, then you are in fact making Kanye the token he is accused of being. So please, don't do that. Don't go there.
Sonny's Corner with Sonny Johnson. Saturday from 1 to 3 p.m. East on Sirius XM Patriot 125.